plane, a hand-launched glider with a 20-inch wingspan, he designed had been published in the premier publication of British Aeromodeling, a magazine entitled simply enough The Aero Modeler. Part of Paul's pride came from design, a bit more from the publication of the plan itself, and still more from the fact that his art and effort had earned him the princely sum of £5. I don't know what that is in US dollars, 2009. Just a little bit on aero modeling. We all remember the 50-cent Gillows, hand-tossed gliders and wind-up planes that we played with as kids, but the Aero Modeler sees those as just the first baby step in a long, grueling effort to learn how to dance, to learn how to perform the tarantella effect, in fact. Because what they build are these huge, fragile constructions of balsa, glue, and tissue paper, sometimes with wingspans as much as 10 feet. And they're beautiful works of art in themselves, and the whole idea with them is to get them into the air and have them stay up there hanging as long as possible. Paul's plane, the Crescent 2, was able to fly for 45 seconds as its record, and he was extremely proud of that as well. Also part of the aero modeling is the encounter with fate. You build this thing which weighs more or less nothing, has almost no structural integrity, and the idea is to get it with just a simple toss of the hand to stay up there for 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes. And of course, it always goes wrong. They crash and are destroyed instantly, so you may spend a week or so building the thing and it's gone in an instant. If you're successful and you catch the updraft, or the thermals, as the Aero Modeler calls them, the holy thermals, what happens is that your plane flies away and you never see it again. So in your success, you encounter this horrible failure, but it's really the idea that when you become a serious aero modeler, you are taking on the burden, the challenge of encountering fate in every moment. As I say, this little tidbit in a much larger essay got me thinking. Were old issues of the Aero Modeler still available? A quick check on eBay showed that they were, but aside from mentioning that the plan was originally published in the early 40s, I had no way of knowing in which issue the plan had appeared. I suppose I could buy all of the monthly issues from the entire decade and find it that way, but each issue was fairly expensive. I think it would have cost a couple $1,000 to do this. Well, nostalgia costs plenty, I guess. But further searching on the computer led me to a simpler solution. Some aero modeling aficionado had in fact put all the plans ever published in the Aero Modeler, and they were all for sale right here in the good old USA. So for the measly price of a few dollars, I was able to acquire the plan for the Crescent 2 glider. By now, something of my own plan had developed. Even though there was nothing I could do to literally help Paul in the case of this debilitating stroke, I could send him a copy of the Crescent 2's plan and cheer him up. But almost immediately, I realized that an even cheerier strategy would be to send him the glider itself, which of course meant that I would have to build it, which immediately I set out to do. A trip to the local hobby store, a great place run by a chain-smoking right-winger. When I paid for my supplies, he mentioned that he wouldn't be open the next day, Flag Day. When I said, well, who would be open on Flag Day? He asked me if I were a patriot. I replied that I considered myself a super patriot. At which point he leapt from his seat behind the counter to shake my hand. Today we need people like you more than ever, son. True, true, I replied. My basic plan was simple. Build the Crescent 2 and send it to Paul to cheer him up, including a short note wishing him well. But as I began to build the thing, and I am not a handyman. I cannot build anything. In fact, I do not even have hands. But as I began to build the thing, I think little buds began to form. And I started to realize that, in fact, I did have hands. And one of the most amazing things about this project was the way my entire body, the way my entire mental state was being pulled into this 60-year-old plan for a very fragile but very beautiful work of art. And I found myself encountering physically the very things that he had done long, long ago as just a little lad who took a beaming delight in playing with these toys. but also these works of art. Where did I leave off? Oh, but a slightly devilish idea occurred to me. What if the glider appeared one day in a box with no return address, with no explanatory letter? Could the artifact of the Crescent 2 appearing more or less out of the blue cause a sudden shock in Paul's neural networks, creating a host of new pathways as a sudden, unexpected eruption of the past as a physical object that he could hold in his hands took over? The obvious answer was a resounding yes. And after checking with Christine and Dimitri, I decided on a course of action. On day one, I would send the mystery box to Paul. And on the next day, I would send a letter telling the whole story so he would be able to explain it. And that's exactly what happened. Now, while the plan was guaranteed success, as I mailed the letter on the second day of the operation, I realized that a couple of glitches did in fact exist. One was that, though guaranteed success, the plan was obviously concocted by a crackpot, and so it was doomed to failure. More importantly, it was more or less a little too late now, for by this time Paul had already come back to a large extent from the debilitating stroke. And though he was still working on a full recovery, he had made amazing, downright heroic progress. Still, as I waited to see if Paul would respond to my plan, I felt that in one way or another it would do some good work, and that in fact turned out to be the case. In less than a week, a shaky handwritten letter from Paul arrived, telling me that the arrival of the Crescent 2 had been a wonderful surprise, and suggesting that if I were ever passing through Ithaca, and if you know anything about Ithaca, no one has ever just passing another crackpot idea from Paul, that I was welcome to stop by for a visit. He did warn me, though, that given the condition and in his recovery, he was only up and out of bed for a couple of hours during the day, from 11:30 to 2. Well, in fact, in less than a week, I was more or less passing by Ithaca on my way here. And so I wrote back saying that I would indeed stop by around noon on this past Monday. While lunching with Paul and Diane Ackerman, I learned a couple of interesting things, eminently Paul. When I asked him if the mystery box had had any effect on him in terms of the sudden transformative shock of having the past suddenly erupt on him out of nowhere, he said no. I recognized the Crescent 2 immediately and nodded my head politely. But Paul told me, even though he was cautioned against it, he simply could not resist taking the glider outside. The temperature was cool, but not too cool. Diane's cutoff point, I believe, is 40 degrees, and I think it was 42 that day. He took it outside and for a frantic half hour or so tossed the glider around the backyard. It flew admirably. Paul said, grinning like that lad that he must have been long ago. Well, to conclude this report, for the time being at least, and I suspect that this report is in progress, and I want to develop the field report from the Handless Handyman in more detail later. But to conclude, I would have to say that the operation, or the experiment rather, seems to have had some success in terms of Paul, but perhaps even more for me. The image of Paul, now just short of 80, dressed in his usual outfit. In this case, it was a light blue terry cloth tracksuit, sockless and loafer, just as Ed said. The image of this great writer, mind-altering teacher, his still full head of snow-white hair, damn him. This image of this wonderful old guy tossing the glider into the air, chasing after it, tossing it again. A huge grin just lighting up his face, his eyes as wide as can be. That image. Thank you.